Hi there, we're going to look now at strategies for survival. This is again taken from Mearsheimer. So let's do that. Let's share the screen, strategies for survival. Okay. You'll remember from earlier lectures probably that, survival is oftentimes what realists, especially defensive realists like Waltz, say is the goal of states, right? And it's sort of tied into all of the other goals as well, because, okay, if you can't survive, then you can't do anything else, right? Because you don't exist anymore. So this is going to go over some of the strategies that Mearsheimer points out states will use their power to do. So basically, states want to maximize their power. That's a very offensive realist sort of thing to say. Defensive realists might disagree. They might just say, no, they don't want to maximize their power. They just need enough power to survive. But for Mearsheimer, they want to maximize their power. They do that by being wealthy, right? Which is remember, the potential power, the latent power, the sort of prerequisite for power, but not power itself. The main way, though, is to have the mightiest land forces in their region. Remember, we talked all last time about land forces, why they were important, why they were different from air and sea forces, why they were special. And then the other way is nuclear superiority, which we've also mentioned a couple of times, but it's the way that, if one state could get nuclear superiority, that would mean that it would be the only one that could use nuclear weapons effectively. Nobody else could attack them with nuclear weapons. We've talked about a few ways of doing that. Another way that maybe we haven't mentioned, at least not recently, is a state could build an umbrella, like a defense system around itself that would prevent nuclear missiles from reaching the homeland. And there's an element of this, right, the United States is trying to do with missile defense systems, early warning systems, placing them in Eastern Europe. And that sort of threatens the Soviet nuclear deterrent. But anyway. So there's these are the strategies that states can use to shift the balance of power in their favor. The main strategy for Mearsheimer is war. So war is the best way. It's the main way that states can shift the balance of power back in their favor. If Russia, for example, since we're talking about Russia, if they invade Ukraine and they defeat Ukraine, they will they'll do a few things. Like one, they'll destroy the Ukrainian army, or they'll degrade it quite seriously. And so then that's a country on their border that can't defend itself now, or not as effectively. It'll also increase its territory, perhaps, right? If it wins the war, it's already annexed Crimea. So it'll have ports in the Black Sea where it can put naval vessels and where it doesn't have to pay any sort of rent or anything for that. So anyway, war is the main strategy. Another one is blackmail, which is cost-free but ineffective. I think we're going to talk about all these, so I shouldn't explain them all on this slide because we'll have other slides to explain them. Bait and bleed is another one. Bloodletting, which is a bit easier than bait and bleed. Balancing, which can end up in war. Buck passing, which actually, everybody loves to do this. It avoids all the costs. Appeasement and bandwagoning. He says in particular for appeasement and bandwagoning, it's not very smart actually to involve yourself in that. You might think it will help you, but it actually is just conceding power. And so it's never a good idea. So we'll go on now. So war. Mearsheimer says, look, yeah, sure, there's the great illusion. Norman Angell, he's writing back in the 1920s, and he says, look, war's not profitable anymore, but Mearsheimer disagrees. He says, no, it is. Conquest can still increase the relative power of the conquering state. We sort of covered that with that Russia example that I gave. But of course, it doesn't just work for Russia, obviously, it works for any country. If you conquer more territory, for Mearsheimer, at least you increase the relative power of the conquering state. Part of Norman Angell's argument against that is that, look, let's say Russia does conquer the whole of Ukraine, for example. Well, okay, great. Now they have all those extra resources. They also have all those extra people to take care of now. They have to, make sure they're clothed and dressed and, and have healthcare and education and And so you know, the amount of resources that you took, you now have to spend on keeping the population. You know, it's sort of like as well the Scottish independence argument, but in reverse. In Britain, you know, there's this sort of debate, like, should Scotland get its independence, right? And so, you know, part of the calculation of that is, well, Scotland currently, it costs more to run than it generates. So it takes like a lot of money from London, from the central government, to keep it running. Now, if it detaches itself from London, well, now it's in a deficit, right? Because it costs more to run the country than they make in revenue. And so, you know, that's sort of Norman Angel's argument against war. It's like, well, you can take over that territory, but it might end up costing you money to run it. So it might not increase your power at all. But Mearsheimer disagrees. Mearsheimer says that there are economic benefits. He says that defense spending, which you have to increase your defense spending if you want to have a war, that doesn't harm your economy, though. Actually, in the USA and UK, it increases. It's good for your economy, right? You've got big defense industries there that benefit and grow as you spend more money on defense. Technology makes repression easier, not harder, which means, you know, sure, like communications becoming more easy between groups of civilians and perhaps political groups as well, maybe minority groups. They can communicate better, but also governments can monitor that communication more easily as well now. So it makes repression easier, not harder. Conquered territories can be taxed and factories can be confiscated. So Germany mobilized 30% of the French, 42 to 44% of Dutch, Belgian, and Norwegian national income. They got that. And they can also confiscate natural resources in a country. And there's other benefits. Half of Napoleon's forces in Russia were not French. They'd raised them from conquered territories. So you can get soldiers and workers that you didn't have before. You can gain strategic territory. Israel is a good example where they took the Golan Heights, which was a strategic, you know, it's high ground from which, you know, you can sort of easily threaten / defend the space around that high ground. With Israel, they're in a sort of very small area which can be easily sort of attacked from all sides. But you know, adding the West Bank, adding Sinai, adding the Golan Heights sort of improved their geographic situation a little bit. So strategic territory can be gained. And then the other thing that it does is annexation or annihilation. It knocks the country out of the ranks of the great powers. So if Germany, for example, right? Germany was a great power going into World War II and had been for centuries. Well, 1 century maybe beforehand, if you also count Prussia. And so the total defeat of Germany after the Second World War knocks them out. Now that's one fewer great powers. If you're the United States or the Soviet Union, now the Soviet Union, who have, you know, as Russia have had to worry about Germany for a long time, well, now they don't really have to worry about Germany because they're utterly defeated. So that can increase their power in Europe. Rome did it to Carthage, right? They assaulted the ground famously. Right? They just knocked out their rival. Now their rival doesn't exist anymore. There's no rival. So that's one way that it can increase your power. Blackmail is that you threaten force. The good thing about it is it's cheap, right? Because you just say, hey, and maybe this is what Russia's doing now. They're saying, hey, look, if you don't give us what we want in terms of promise not to take Ukraine into NATO, give us that or we'll invade Ukraine. That seems to be the threat. And so the good thing about that tactic is it's very cheap, right? All Russia has to do is move a few soldiers around in their own territory. And they haven't lost anything, not very much at all, and maybe they'll get their way. The problem is it's unlikely to work against great powers because great powers possess a large amount of power and they're unlikely to want to give up power to a great power rival. So the theory would go that, well, if this is just a blackmail from Russia, it's unlikely to work against the United States because the United States has themselves a lot of power, and they're unlikely to want to increase Russia's power and decrease their own in Europe. So here's one example that Mearsheimer uses. I guess in 1909, Austria annexed Bosnia. Germany threatened Russia with military force if it intervened, and Russia backed down. So it can be successful, it's cheap, but usually it shouldn't work against a great power rival. Bait and bleed, it's a good one. You cause two rivals to go to war with one another while remaining on the sidelines. So there's not very many examples, but states are always worried about this. Both sides worried in the Cold War that they might be baited into nuclear war with one another by a third party. Like, who would benefit if those two guys destroyed each other, right? There's a third country somewhere that would benefit from that. I don't know who it is, maybe the Europeans, maybe India or something, or China, could be China. But it was maybe too early for China during the Cold War. Anyway, so bait and bleed. The idea is you try and get those other two countries to fight each other and destroy each other, or at least weaken each other significantly. Catherine the Great expressed the hope that she could push Austria and Germany into a war with France, and the war did happen. But I think Mearsheimer doesn't think that Catherine the Great really made it happen. But if she had have made it happen, that would have been a bait and bleed strategy. Another one's bloodletting. It's like the last one, but no baitings involved. So Lenin took the Soviet Union out of World War I to allow Germany to fight the Allies and just bloodlet. So they both weaken each other. You didn't necessarily start the conflict, but you're allowing them to continue. You're encouraging them to continue. That's bloodletting. Senator Truman, who obviously became President Truman later on, in 1941, he suggested letting the Germans and the Soviets fight it out, and to support the losing side to keep the fight going so as many as possible could be killed. That's a great example of bloodletting there. Keep the war going between two rivals and hope that they, and now your power. So in Senator Truman's calculation, the United States would become much more powerful in relation to Germany and the Soviet Union that would be weakening one another, destroying each other's factories and soldiers and tanks and aircraft and that sort of thing. Balancing is the next tactic. Balancing, we've already talked about this quite a bit, I think, in the course. It's a big part of realist international political theory. But the idea is make your diplomatic communication center on your resolve to draw a line in the side and to fight war if necessary. Okay, not sure about that one, to be honest with you. I wrote these, but I don't remember what that meant. It looks like this. Yeah. Create a defensive alliance to contain the dangerous opponent. That makes sense to me. I think it's with the diplomatic communication, you have to be able to stay flexible a little bit, right? Don't commit yourself either way, because you have to be able to switch between one or the other to sort of, as the power shifts. So they can create defensive alliances. That seems fairly straightforward. To contain a dangerous opponent, right? That's what NATO would argue that it's doing with the Russians. Mobilize additional resources of their own. Yeah, that's an interesting point. Is that, that's internal balancing. Internal balancing is mobilizing your own resources, because most great powers, though, it says here, are already near maximum peacetime capacity, but that's not the case for offshore balances. So Britain and America in particular, maybe Japan as well, is probably quite a good example of this. But the UK and the USA, they're classical examples. They don't maintain their full military capacity during peacetime. Because the stock power of water, they have time to ramp up in the case of a war, so they just keep it. They keep their forces at a lower level during peacetime. But like Germany and Russia, they can't really do that because they share land borders with other great powers, China and India, I guess that's only Russia that do that, but an attack can come very quickly, so they always have to be ready to fight a potential war. Next strategy is book passing. This is, I think I mentioned on the first slide, this is an attractive one to a lot of great powers. You want to get another power to balance. So book passing in a nutshell is saying, no, we don't want to take on this potential aggressor. We'll try and get another great power to take them on instead. So, think about like think about NATO, and think about President Trump when he was in the White House and what he was saying about NATO. If you're Germany, France, I'll say Britain, but Britain's actually was spending more on defense than Germany and France. But other NATO partners as well, they're sort of book passing, right? They themselves are not taking the full responsibility for the defense of their own country. They're passing the buck to the United States. They're getting the United States to balance Russia. They're not balancing Russia themselves. So that gives them some sort of it's cheaper for them, right? It's lower cost again. But here's the way to do it. You get another power to balance. So you have good relations with the aggressor. So, if Russia is the aggressor in this state, right, we've got Germany has all these sort of oil pipelines, the Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, oil and gas, good, fairly positive relations with Russia, positive trade relations, that sort of thing. Cool relations with a potential book receiver. So this would be the United States. So, and then make yourself an imposing target. And allow the intended book catcher to grow in power. So you allow the United States to get more powerful. You make yourself kind of menacing so that nobody wants to attack you. And then you have good relations with the potential aggressor, sort of cooler relations with the ones who you want to balance the aggressor. See, it's quite complicated and convoluted way of doing it, but it's an effective strategy because it's cheap, because you don't have to fight them, and then you end up in like a bloodletting or a bait and bleed sort of a situation where two other great powers are fighting and you're not involved. It uses actually the US as the example in World War II, where they come into it in 41, but they don't really send troops into Europe until 44, which leaves the Soviets to grind down the Nazi army, the Wehrmacht. So that's a book passing, the US book passed to the Soviet Union. The UK tried the same thing in World War I. It says here, great powers usually want to do this one. This is a strong strategy that's very attractive to great powers. Get somebody else to do the fighting. And you can see actually how it's related to bait and bleed and bloodletting as well. So here's the ones that you don't want to do according to Mearsheimer. One is you just join forces with a more powerful opponent. But this violates the balance of power logic, right? You're supposed to balance against the more powerful country because the system's supposed to be in balance. This way, it's not being in balance because here's it's getting stronger and stronger, like heavier and heavier. And then you jump on top of it and make it even heavier, right? It's dangerous to the state that concedes because you're conceding power to a stronger and making them stronger at your expense. So it's not bandwagoning. Mearsheimer says it's not very smart, but is a strategy. And then appeasement. Try to check the appetite for power of the aggressor by giving them some power. That's not gone down well in history. Maybe and this is something that the United States is trying not to do with Russia now, right? Russia wants NATO to back up a little bit away from their border, which makes sense that they would want that. And of course, they're using sort of threats of the use of force in order to try and get that maybe blackmailing, right? And maybe they'll use war to achieve that. And so the United States is trying not to do this strategy of appeasement, because if they give a little bit, then Russia will presumably think, oh, okay, well, we can do this again and get a little bit more, right? and then Russia becomes more powerful, the United States becomes less powerful, and that's not good. But the idea is based on the possibility that the Russian aggression, right, or the aggression of any great power is based on a feeling of insecurity. And that's what Russia's saying. It's like, look, we feel insecure. You've got tanks in territory that's right on our border, territory that actually used to be part of our country. And you're putting missiles in there and missile defense systems in there. And that's threatening our security. This is our doorstep. You know, you're putting these troops on our doorstep. And so, you know, the idea with appeasement is to say, look, you know, we recognize that you're feeling insecure, and so we're going to increase your security a little bit to appease you, right? To make it so that you have nothing to fight about. All right, so that's a possible strategy, but it's not a popular one, and it's one that hasn't got a very good name. And so states are usually trying to avoid this, doing that. And that's it for strategies of survival.